Live and direct, live and I take no jive.
Legalize it.
So how much can a koala bear? Koala bear, koala bear. Koala bear. Barry pulls a joint out of his pocket. Bill says, "Great, Barry, a reefer."
Hi, welcome back to the Koala podcast. And I've got Beau Whitney from Whitney Economics, who is Mr. Hemp and Cannabis Economics. Been around for a very long time, as long as anybody's been sort of talking about these issues. And you mean you started your company back in, what, 2015, 14, didn't you?
Yeah, 2014. Been in the business about a decade now.
Yeah, I mean, I think I started 2015. I remember you being one of the very few names that I would see who was commenting regularly with regard to sort of economic and industry issues. Of course, there's a 1,000 million people now. It's very nice to see you a bit like me. You just keep on plowing on, yes?
Yeah, at the time there wasn't a whole lot of data available, and so I carved a niche, and then the data is still at times is kind of sketchy, and so I continue to maintain that leadership role in terms of providing economic data and data on the hemp and cannabis industries, not only in the US, but globally as well.
Well, that's interesting. We might try and get to that later in the conversation, or if not, have another conversation about that, because to be honest, in this day and age, that's what interests me more. As there's a lot of words about the US, but developing markets are always more interesting, and hopefully they can learn from other people's mistakes. The reason we're talking is you just produced a report on hemp acreage in the US, and the shrinkage is phenomenal. What were the numbers again?
What we wanted to take a look at, the way that we view the market is in terms of capacity. A lot of the reports that come out from the US federal government talk about acres planted and acres harvested and the like. But I'm trying to look at how much demand can these acres service. And so I look at things a little bit differently in terms of acreage. And we had been putting together forecasts for acreage going back, 4, 5, 6 years. And there was a lot of potential in the marketplace as the hemp market deployed in the United States. Initially, early on during the pilot years in 2014 through like 2018, a lot of the focus was on fiber and grains, and then everything shifted with the U.S. Farm Bill in 2018.
Well, that was what I was going to ask you. Is it possible to define between those two things if you're looking at what people are planting? How are you managing to collate that data? It must be quite difficult. Or do people say, I am actually planting for hemp for this reason, or my clients want this hemp for this reason or that reason?
Yeah, well, during that interim period from 2014 to 2018, there were pilot programs. And so you had to register basically your intention. So a lot of research was done. You had to partner as a private entity. You had to partner with the departments of ag in each state. And then you had to have a university as well.
So that was that classic Kentucky model, wasn't it?
Yeah, so there was a lot of data out there, and it was predominantly fiber and grain. Grains for human consumption, fiber for different applications. But then as the Farm Bill of 2018 was signed into law, and in the run-up to that, prices, because there was a shortage of supply of cannabinoids, CBD, that was coming in vogue, and the price for CBD was through the roof. In some instances, it'd be $40,000 a kilo. And because of the great demand and the shortage of supply. And so after the 2018 Farm Bill, a lot of people entered into the market figuring they would supply CBD or raw materials into the CBD market, make this enormous profit, and then retire,
Everybody's moving into this business and they're retiring before they've even started, haven't they?
Yeah, and we deployed some surveys at the time, and early on, 65% of the people that we talked to, and we had enough statistically viable data to project throughout the United States. So multiple states, et cetera, et cetera. 65% of those that planted didn't even have a buyer for their crop, you know? And so there was this huge influx of supply, but there wasn't a whole lot of demand, or at least there wasn't a whole lot of a channel to get the plant matter processed and into the retail channel. And so there was an infrastructural gating item. And so as a result of that, huge supply, yes, 525,000 acres of licensed acres, 525,000, 82% was for cannabinoid production, but no buyers. And so prices went from that $40,000, down and down and down.
And was
And
that
the prices just collapsed here.
the growers in terms of the hemp, were they confined to specific states? Could you identify which states were growing more?
Yeah. Yeah, in terms of process, what we did is we contacted every state Department of Agriculture, and we said, what is your breakdown of fiber, grain, and cannabinoids? How many acres, and give us as much data as you could, because at that time there wasn't a whole lot going on at the United States Department of Agriculture. They were just standing up their program. And so even today we rely on state departments of ag because they do a really good job in supporting our efforts. And as does the USDA for that matter. But we got the data and parsed through it. And then we started tracking prices because the question was, okay, there's so much supply, there's not enough infrastructure, there's not a good path to bring this product to market. And so what's going to happen? And so at that time, there was a lot of states that had entered, or growers in states had entered. And when prices collapsed, there was a lot of reduction in those states of the acreage licensed. But the very next year in 2020, other states came online. And so the farmers made the same mistake. They didn't learn from the mistakes from other states. And so there was this glut of supply of raw materials as well as CBD, distillate and isolate and all this stuff. And so prices collapsed. And as a result of that collapse, businesses, processors needed to find a way to monetize their crop. And from there, the whole cannabinoid and the intoxicating cannabinoid market was born, right? And so they took the CBD that was derived from the plant matter, and then they converted it through a chemical process and they isolated things out, reconfigured them, and then they were able to produce THC, the intoxicating psychoactive portion of the cannabis plant. And so then they started productizing that. So there was a huge market out there, not only for CBD, but then also other hemp-derived intoxicating products. So, at one point, there was a lot of hysteria around there, around that evolution of the market, and there still is.
Well, it just seems to be getting bigger and bigger, that hysteria by the day. I mean, if
yeah, we look at survey
California this past week, I mean, I've never seen him move so fast on something. And in the last 5 years, or however many years he's been in, but that, and to be honest, I know the farm bill's not his problem, but he let things come across his desk and sign them without. So the blame seems to be being laid at other people's feet, where of course partly it's the administration.
Yeah, what we did is we surveyed 40,000 businesses across the United States, and we got a really strong sampling of responses, and we got responses from almost every state. And so we were able to size the cannabinoid market. We interviewed distributors, manufacturers, as well as those retailers. And so when we looked at the total market, the total potential market of cannabinoids that were derived from hemp, it was a $28.8 billion market. So huge market. And so with now, not all of that was legal because there are some states that had proactively prohibited this stuff. Others restricted the sale. And then others said, based upon the court determination and based upon the fact that it was federally legal, a lot of states just took a hands-off approach and just said, well, if it's legal federally, it's legal for us, right? And so there was all sorts of gradations of the market. Well, the federal government, with the exception of the USDA, took a fairly hands-off approach to policy associated with hemp. And as such, the states started intervening. And so they created all these distortions in the market, some prohibited, some restricted, some wide open. And so because of some of the hysteria around cannabinoids and because of some effective lobbying by the marijuana industry, there was an essential villainization of the cannabinoid industry that was hemp derived. From there, with this legislation, it started chipping away at the confidence of investors and confidence of operators and the like in this space. And because there was a lack of confidence, there was a lot of changes in policy at the state level. There was a tremendous amount of uncertainty. So what we were trying to assess in our evaluation of the demand for acreage, we were trying to assess how is that uncertainty impacting the investment in the deployment of infrastructure, in the opportunities for hemp farmers. Well, as it turns out, another thing was that one of the big drivers of the demand forecast for acreage was coming from the grain sector. And the grain sector had queued up these applications with the Food and Drug Administration to allow for hemp grains in animal feed. And they submitted application after application. They followed standard procedure with the FDA, and then the FDA said, well, we need a little bit more information. Well, we need a little bit of information. And then they said, well, we need now Congress to provide us the authority to regulate this stuff. And so they kept on pushing the can down the road. And as a result, continued murkiness, which was impacting the potential of grains for animal feed. Now, grains for human consumption had already been considered safe, generally regarded as safe, or grass. And so it was a little bit of a head scratcher as to why there was so much, delay in the approval process by the FDA. Well, one thing to note is that there's a global shortage of animal feed. And so in the United States, animal farmers were culling their herds because they weren't able to get enough animal feed. Well, had it been approved, hemp grains for animal feed purposes would have been a great way to shore up the gaps in the supply chain. Well, that didn't happen. Our early forecasts said that assuming this happens, then there's millions of acres of demand for grains alone. And each year we pushed out our forecast and reduced it because there was delay after delay after delay by the FDA. Well, finally, recently, the FDA finally got around to providing guidance on one small sector.
That was chicken feed, wasn't it?
Or chicken feed, yeah, chicken feed. And they restricted it, and they put so many limits on the amount of THC content and CBD content, despite the fact that the science and all these studies at these US universities said there's no pass through, or it gets out of the system, there's no toxins, et cetera, et cetera. The FDA, through the American Animal Feed Coalition, they set these limits despite the science at such low levels that some machinery cannot even detect the parts per million. And the FDA defined THC and CBD for that matter, as more toxic than arsenic and
I
cadmium.
find, look, I'm with you. I find it totally bizarre. I mean, when I visit the States, I spend my whole time avoiding corn syrup because it kills me.
Yeah.
But yet for some reason that this absolute obsession with THC at minute levels is it's beyond comprehension.
Yeah. So add to that a lot of this hysteria over cannabinoids from a policy and legislative and a regulatory level at the state level. A lot of it is just sweeping generalizations. The policy is regarding hemp. They don't differentiate hemp for cannabinoid purposes, hemp for fiber purposes, hemp for grain purposes, or seeds. They just have this blanket castigation of and villainization of hemp in general. And so what that is doing is the ever-changing rules at the state level combined with federal uncertainty. We viewed this as like, well, there's very little chance of much progress and huge scale for grains in the near term. The amount of investment going into the infrastructure is being suppressed due to the uncertainty created by all these changing rules that are more blunt instruments rather than precise legislation. And because of the uncertainty and the lack of investment flows, then we just didn't see a path because there was a lack of infrastructure. We just didn't see a path towards last year's forecast. And so we just, especially considering these tight limits on animal feed, because there's really nothing to prevent the FDA of applying those very same, very tight limits to human food, despite the fact that they said, well, it's a different process, right? And so we're seeing so much uncertainty in this that we're like, when we talk to farmers, they're like, why would I grow this crop? I don't even know if it's going to be legal by the time it's harvested, and then a separate company that I'm consulting with, they offered to do contracts for 350,000 acres of fiber and 100,000 acres of grain. And we couldn't get farmers to sign up for those contracts because they said there's not enough infrastructure to process this, or there's too much uncertainty at the federal and state level. And so this is preventing farmers, suppressing demand for acres from farmers. They're saying, hey, this is too much of a hassle. I can get, a more stable, consistent price from other crops. So I'm not going to add it into my rotation. And so this is just a big, it's
Here's just a quick question with the primary producers and the contracts. What sort of percentage of their land were they looking to apply hemp to? Was if they had 100 acres, would it be 5% of it or 10%? I mean, what was the sort of standard to be safe? What were they before all this sort of mistrust in DC? What were they thinking they would test it at in terms of percentage?
It really depended upon the risk appetite of each farmer. Some would do, a few hundred acres, others would do tens of thousands of acres. And or they would do a rotation, during a certain part of the year, or they would introduce the rotation on an annualized basis. And so each farmer, depending upon the sophistication, had different strategies for the production of hemp on their lands. But I just couldn't get enough to sign up to make it viable. And so I'm going out now. I'm going up to Saskatchewan to meet with some investors that want to help fund hemp farmers and cover their production costs. And we can see if that will incentivize the farmers in the US to actually jump into this.
What are the Canadian rules on hemp? I mean, I presume they're at a 0.1 or whatever it is as well.
Yeah, it's 0.3% THC, but
0.3.
what's going on is that the hysteria around US hemp policy,
It's leaking
it's
north.
leaking upwards, right? And some of the opportunities that hemp farmers were able to take advantage of in Canada supporting US demand are no longer there, or some of them are being impacted by this, low THC level, in chicken feed. And so it's just creating all these distortions in the market. So, we had a forecast that combined cannabinoids, hemp fiber, and hemp grain in 2030 of about 5.5 million acres, which is really nothing when it comes to the U.S. Agricultural sector. It doesn't even compete with soy or with corn or anything like that.
Well, and I
Although
presume
it's
it
pretty
doesn't
significant.
allow, if it's such small amount, doesn't allow other parts of the economy to develop businesses that use this product.
That's right. There's a multiplier effect associated with that. But we took down the forecast from 5.5 million acres to just right around 1 million acres. Now, for perspective, even though the reduction from last year's forecast was 82% by 2030, it's still basically double the amount of acreage that was at its peak in 2019, right? It's just a different mix. And so our forecast is mainly focused on grains for animal oil for human feed, and also then grains fibers for the automobile industry, for the plastics, and for the construction industries. And so we're looking at that, and those seem to have a easier path if you can get farmers to grow it. But right now, last year there was only about 30,000 acres, and we're licensed, and we're forecasting 1 million acres, within the next 5.5, 6 years. So that's still a pretty significant uptick, but just not the opportunities for farmers that we once thought was present. And that's all because of policy.
What's happening in jurisdictions like Brazil or China? Are they investing? Are they seeing an opportunity because of the drawback in the US?
The US was really kind of driving things because they had so many acres, and about half the global production at one point. Now the other countries, especially like in the EU, it's a much more stable industry. They've taken a more practical approach on how they regulate it. They regulate things more at the product intention level rather than at the farm gate. And that's the key differentiating factor in the US versus the rest of the world. And so there's opportunities. The hemp coming out of China, that's problematic because there's not as many agricultural controls. And so there's a lot more potential to have heavy metals and other pollutants in the products. And so
what about the Australians? Are the Australians doing anything?
Yeah, they are. And so New Zealand and Australia, and they're taking kind of a refreshing approach to policy because they're trying to support.
They certainly aren't with cannabis, so it's good to see they are with hemp.
Yeah, but there's some policies whereby you can do R&D in the space and get that subsidized or at least partially paid for by the Australian government.
That's the Australian way.
And so in that sense, that's, supporting the growth and development. You still have to have some skin in the game, but at least there's some progress and some openness. Whereas right now, in the US, I would describe it as dysfunctional at best. And so because it's so dysfunctional, once again, there's an increase in risk, increase in uncertainty, lack of incentive, and just really not a healthy policy environment. And so I think what I have made recommendations into the staff at the House Ag Committee on the Farm Bill. So I've actually presented to them and provided guidance on my take, because we don't take a position on this stuff. We just report the numbers. And what we said is you have to regulate at the product intention level, so that you can have more precise rules and regulations around intoxication. But, I was in a meeting with the Senate Majority Leader's staff a few years ago, and one person said, "Why do I need to test my roof tiles for THC content?" Right? That
The
made no sense. And
blackbirds
that
aren't going to be
always,
smoking them, are they?
yeah, that always resonated with me, right? And so you shouldn't have to test your roof tiles for THC content, right? And so that kind of was where the whole concept of regulating with product intention was born. It was in that meeting. It was a roundtable meeting. Common sense solutions. There's reasonable regulation. But right now, like in California, I just provided some data. There's a really, really significant market for cannabinoids in the California market. And there's a potential for the state, which is running budget deficits, significant ones, to glean up to $258 million in just sales tax revenue alone. And there's all sorts of ancillary businesses that are supported by the hemp industry, and even other industries that are non-ancillary, just different sectors. And they're benefiting from the deployment of cannabinoids and fibers and grains. And let me give you an example. In the state of Minnesota, the craft beer industry was in a state of decline to the point where a lot of the craft brewers were on the cusp of going out of business. In the state of Minnesota, they basically legalized cannabinoids for human consumption. And so the industry was deployed. A lot of cannabinoid beverages were introduced into the general public, into the retail, even in grocery stores. And the craft brewers embraced the cannabinoid beverages and included them in their portfolio product offerings. That saved a lot of the beer producers in Minnesota.
It's funny you should say
And
that, 'cause I
so-
just read a statement this morning. I don't know if it's the Beer Association of America but anyway, they were praising Newsom for doing exactly what he's done. And then you tell me this now. It like anything else with this industry, it's bizarre because everybody is at each other's throats when they shouldn't be, should they?
Yeah, and you've got the potential to do electronic vehicle batteries from hemp. And so if there's a conversion over to the green economy, why would you suppress the growth and development of the infrastructure rather than supporting this, right?
Well, I mean, the simple act of growing you can earn money because you improve your soil, somebody else's soils. You can be growing contract hemp to improve. I just find it bizarre. There's so many opportunities and unresearched opportunities that we don't know about, yet we're obsessed by this. Well, as you say, the CBD and THC content of a plant that it's not going to go anywhere near a human body.
Yeah, when we looked at it, when we looked at the 41,000 potential jobs in California, for example, that are born from the hemp industry, when you look at the $1.6 billion in wages that are paid, the $258 million in potential sales tax revenue, and then when you look at some of the survey responses that we got, 83% of the respondents said that if there were laws enacted similar to what was signed, by Governor Newsom just recently,